The phone call that destroyed my world came exactly 3 minutes after I heard my daughter planning my funeral. Sarah's voice was honey-sweet through the receiver, but her words hit me like ice water. "Mom, we're so excited about your surprise party this weekend," she chirped, while just minutes earlier, I'd heard her telling her husband David, "Once Mom's gone, we can finally renovate this dump of a house and sell it for what it's really worth." Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and subscribe. Ready for an amazing story? Let's begin. 3 years ago, I lost my hearing in a car accident that should have killed me. The doctors said it was permanent, nerve damage so severe that even hearing aids couldn't help. I learned to read lips, communicate through writing, and navigate a silent world that felt like living underwater. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Harrison called with what he termed a medical miracle. An experimental procedure had worked beyond anyone's expectations. My hearing had returned completely, crystal clear, as if someone had suddenly turned the volume of life back up to full blast. I decided to surprise everyone, especially Sarah. She'd been so devoted during my deaf years, visiting twice a week, bringing groceries, handling my appointments. She was planning a birthday party for me, my 55th, and I thought it would be the perfect moment to reveal that I could hear again. What a joyful surprise it would be. But surprises, I've learned, cut both ways. This morning, while Sarah thought I was napping upstairs, she and David were discussing party arrangements in my kitchen. I heard every single word from the top of the stairs, where I'd frozen in shock. "How much longer do we have to keep this charade up?" David's voice carried easily through the old house. "Your mother's birthday party, the weekly visits, pretending we actually care about her boring stories she writes on those little notepads." "Just until the will is settled," Sarah replied, and I could hear her moving dishes around, probably cleaning up after the lunch I'd made them. "Dr. Harrison said the experimental surgery could have complications. Her health is fragile anyway. We just need to be patient a little longer." Patient. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you know how much this house is worth now that the neighborhood's been gentrified? We're sitting on a gold mine, Sarah, and your mother just keeps hanging on, getting in the way of our plans." I pressed myself against the hallway wall, my newly restored hearing picking up every devastating detail. "The party will be good for appearances," Sarah continued, "especially if something happens to her soon after. People will remember how much we loved her, how we celebrated her life. It'll look natural when she passes." My hands found the wall to steady myself. These were the same hands that had held Sarah when she had nightmares as a child, that had nursed her through fevers, that had applauded at every school play and graduation. And now she was discussing my death like a business transaction. I made my way silently back to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. For 3 years, I'd thought the accident had taken away my hearing. Now I realized it had actually protected me from hearing truths that would have shattered me much sooner. My phone rang, making me jump. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to answer. When I finally did, she was practically bubbling with enthusiasm. "Mom, I just wanted to check in about Saturday. Are you excited about your party?" I found my voice, though it felt strange to speak aloud after so long of mostly writing. "Yes, dear. Very excited. We've invited about 20 people from the neighborhood, plus some of your old nursing friends. David's been working so hard on the decorations. He even made a special playlist of your favorite songs. The irony wasn't lost on me, songs I couldn't have heard until 2 weeks ago." "That sounds wonderful, Sarah." Each word felt like glass in my throat. "Oh, and Mom? I've been thinking, maybe after the party, we should have a serious talk about your living situation. This house is getting to be too much for you to maintain, and David and I have been researching some lovely assisted living facilities." There it was, the beginning of the end they'd been planning. "We'll see, dear," I managed. After hanging up, I sat in my bedroom for a long time, listening to the sounds of my house, sounds I hadn't heard in 3 years. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticking steadily, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the floorboards creaking as Sarah and David moved around downstairs, probably continuing their conversation about my future. I'd spent 3 years learning to live without sound, adapting to a different world. Now I had to learn something even harder, how to live, knowing that the people I loved most were counting the days until I died. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their planning. They assumed I was still the helpless, deaf woman who needed their care and guidance. They had no idea that Margaret Thompson could hear again. And now that I could hear, I was going to listen very carefully to everything they thought I couldn't understand. The next morning brought fresh horrors delivered through my apparently perfect hearing. I was in my garden, deadheading the roses that Sarah always complimented, when I heard her on the phone with someone through the open kitchen window. "No, Mother can't hear anything," she was saying, her voice casual as if discussing the weather. "The accident completely destroyed her hearing. She has no idea what we're planning." I knelt behind the rose bushes, my gardening gloves suddenly feeling too tight. "Yes, I'm certain. She reads lips sometimes, but she can't hear conversations from other rooms or when people turn away from her. It's actually been quite convenient." Convenient. My deafness had been convenient for my daughter. "The party is this Saturday. Dr. Harrison said the experimental surgery could have delayed complications, infection, brain swelling, even stroke. If something were to happen right after such a joyful celebration, well, it would seem natural, wouldn't it? An elderly woman's body finally giving out after fighting so hard." I felt bile rise in my throat. They weren't just waiting for me to die naturally. They were planning to help the process along. David's been researching things online. Medications that could cause complications when mixed with her current prescriptions. Nothing traceable, nothing suspicious. Just a loving daughter trying to help her mother manage her many pills. Through the leaves, I could see Sarah pacing in my kitchen, where I'd taught her to make cookies when she was 7. The house alone is worth $800,000 now, plus her life insurance, her savings account, the antique furniture. We're looking at over $1 million, maybe more. And David's been unemployed for 6 months. Though Mother doesn't know that. She still thinks he's working at the architecture firm. No wonder they'd been visiting so often lately. No wonder David had been so interested in my financial papers, offering to help organize my important documents. I have to be smart about this. If she changes her will or gets suspicious, we lose everything. But she trusts me completely. Poor little deaf Margaret, so dependent on her devoted daughter. The cruelest part was the baby voice Sarah used when she said my name, as if I were a confused child instead of the woman who'd raised her alone after her father died. After she hung up, I stayed hidden in the garden for another hour, my mind racing. Every kind gesture from the past 3 years suddenly looked different through this new lens. Sarah's insistence on managing my prescription medications. David's helpful suggestions about updating my will. Their gentle but persistent questions about my health, my energy levels, my memory. They'd been studying me like a laboratory rat, waiting for signs of decline they could exploit. That afternoon, when Sarah came for her usual visit, I watched her with new eyes. She hugged me at the door, the same warm embrace she'd given me hundreds of times since my accident. But now I noticed how quickly she scanned my face, looking for signs of illness or confusion. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" she asked, settling into the kitchen chair where she always sat during our visits. "Oh, I replied, keeping my voice at the same volume I'd used when I was truly deaf. "Some days are better than others." Sarah's eyes lit up with something I now recognized as hope. "Are you having more headaches? You mentioned them last week." I hadn't mentioned headaches. She was fishing, hoping I'd report symptoms that might indicate the experimental surgery was failing. "A few," I lied, watching her reaction carefully. "Maybe we should call Dr. Harrison. Sometimes these experimental procedures have delayed side effects." Her concern sounded so genuine that for a moment I almost forgot what I'd overheard. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," I said. Sarah frowned slightly. "Mom, we can't be too careful. Your health is so important to David and me. We couldn't bear to lose you." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't heard her true feelings through the kitchen window, I would have been completely convinced of her love and concern. "You're such a good daughter," I told her, the words tasting like poison. She beamed at the compliment. "I just want what's best for you. Speaking of which, I've been thinking more about those assisted living places we discussed. Maybe after your party we could visit a few? I found one that looks perfect. They have a memory care unit too, just in case you ever need that level of support." Memory care. For a woman whose only problem was supposedly her hearing. "That sounds nice, dear," I said, playing along. "You always know what's best." After Sarah left, I sat alone in my silent house, silent by choice this time, not because I had to be. I needed to think clearly about what I'd learned and what I was going to do about it. The old Margaret, the deaf Margaret, would have been helpless against this plot. She would have trusted her daughter completely, taken the medications Sarah offered, signed whatever papers David suggested. She would have died, never knowing that the people she loved most had killed her for money. But I wasn't that Margaret anymore. My hearing had given me more than just the ability to perceive sound. It had given me the power to protect myself. I picked up my phone and did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my lawyer directly, without asking Sarah to help me make the appointment. "Margaret!" Henry Walsh's voice was warm and familiar. "I heard about your experimental surgery. How wonderful that it worked. Henry, I need to see you tomorrow, privately, and I need you to keep this meeting completely confidential." There was a pause. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Everything is very wrong, but I have a plan to make it right." The meeting with Henry Walsh opened my eyes to just how thoroughly Sarah and David had been planning my demise. Sitting in his office the next morning, I felt like I was learning about a stranger's life, my own. "Margaret, I have to tell you something troubling," Henry said after I'd explained what I'd overheard. "Sarah came to see me 3 weeks ago. She was asking very specific questions about your will, about the process when you pass away, about how quickly assets could be transferred." My stomach clenched. "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know about probate timelines, whether there were ways to expedite the process. She seemed particularly interested in ensuring that David would have immediate access to your checking accounts for expenses related to your funeral arrangements." Henry's expression was grim. "At the time, I thought she was just being prepared, maybe worried about your health after the surgery. But now you think differently. Combined with what you've told me, yes. Margaret, she also asked me about challenging a will if someone dies under suspicious circumstances. She wanted to know if the will would still be valid if there were questions about your mental state at the time of death." The room felt suddenly cold. "My mental state?" "She mentioned concerns about your memory, your decision-making ability. She suggested that the hearing loss might have caused some cognitive decline." Henry leaned forward. "Margaret, has your daughter ever suggested that you might be developing dementia?" I thought back over the past months. Sarah's gentle corrections when I forgot things I'd never actually forgotten. Her patient explanations of simple tasks I'd been doing for decades. Her concerned comments about my confusion when I asked perfectly reasonable questions. She's been setting up a narrative, I realized aloud, making me appear mentally incompetent. It's a classic manipulation tactic. If she could establish that you were suffering from dementia, she could potentially challenge any changes to your will and claim you weren't competent to make them. Henry opened a file folder. "Which brings me to another concerning point. Your current will leaves everything to Sarah, with David as secondary beneficiary. When did you last review this?" "About 5 years ago, after Robert died. Sarah helped me understand all the legal language. The words felt bitter now. She said it was the simplest way to handle things, that she would take care of everything and make sure Robert's memory was honored." "Margaret, I need to ask you directly. Do you want to make changes to this will?" I thought about the question seriously. 3 days ago, I would have said absolutely not. Sarah was my only child, my precious daughter who'd stayed close to home, who visited regularly, who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. But that Sarah was an illusion, a performance designed to secure her inheritance. The real Sarah was the woman I'd heard planning my death like a dinner party. "Yes," I said firmly, "I want to make significant changes." For the next hour, Henry and I discussed options. I could leave everything to charity, but that felt like spite rather than justice. I could divide the estate among my late husband's nephews, but they lived across the country and barely knew me. Finally, Henry suggested something that made perfect sense. "What about establishing a trust for genuinely needy families? You were a nurse for 30 years. You must have seen how medical emergencies can devastate people financially. You could create a lasting legacy that helps people facing the same kinds of challenges you've overcome." The idea resonated immediately. A foundation to help families dealing with medical crises, managed by a board of trustees who would ensure the money went where it was truly needed. Sarah would receive a modest inheritance, enough to prove I hadn't forgotten her completely, but nothing close to the windfall she was expecting. "I want to do this," I told Henry, "but I need time to think about the details, and I can't let Sarah know about the changes until after my birthday party." "Why wait?" "Because I want to see how far she's willing to go with her plan. If I change the will now and she backs down, I'll never know if she would have actually tried to kill me. But if she proceeds with whatever she's planning, knowing that I trust her completely, then I'll know exactly who my daughter really is." Henry looked uncomfortable. "Margaret, if you're right about their intentions, you could be putting yourself in real danger. I'm already in danger, but now I have something they don't know about. I can hear everything they say and do. That gives me an advantage they don't expect." As I walked out of Henry's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of control over my own life. For 3 years, I'd been dependent on others for so much: communication, navigation, understanding the world around me. I'd grown accustomed to being helped, guided, protected. But the woman walking down Main Street that morning wasn't helpless anymore. She was a hunter, gathering information about prey that didn't even know it was being watched. That evening, Sarah called with an update about the party preparations. Her voice was bright with excitement, but I heard something else underneath, a tightness that suggested nervousness. "Mom, I just wanted to confirm your medication schedule for Saturday. I know the party might be overwhelming, so I've organized all your pills in a special container. That way, you won't have to worry about remembering what to take when." My blood turned to ice. "That's very thoughtful, dear. I've been reading about how excitement and stress can affect people who've had experimental surgeries. Sometimes the brain gets overstimulated and there can be complications. I just want to make sure you're taking everything you need to stay healthy. Everything you need to stay healthy. Or everything you need to die quietly and quickly." "You always take such good care of me," I said. "That's what daughters are for." "Oh, and Mom? David suggested we set up a little station in the kitchen where you can rest if the party gets to be too much. Somewhere quiet where you can take your medication privately, away from the other guests, away from witnesses." After hanging up, I stood in my kitchen looking out at the garden where I'd overheard Sarah's phone conversation. The roses were blooming beautifully, their petals bright red in the evening light. By this time next week, Sarah expected those roses to be decorating my grave. But Sarah had made one critical error in her planning. She'd assumed that the deaf woman was also a helpless woman. Tomorrow, I would show her how wrong she'd been about both things. The morning of my birthday party dawned gray and drizzling, which felt appropriate given what I expected the day to bring. I stood at my bedroom window, watching Sarah and David arrive early to help with final preparations. From my vantage point upstairs, I could see David unloading boxes from their car while Sarah hurried toward my front door, her face animated with what anyone else would read as loving concern. I knew better now. I made my way downstairs, continuing the performance of being a grateful mother whose devoted daughter was throwing her a wonderful celebration. Sarah embraced me at the door, and I noticed she was carrying a small insulated bag. "I brought all your medications, Mom," she said, holding up the bag. "I've organized everything by time of day. Dr. Harrison's nurse helped me make sure I had all the dosages right." Dr. Harrison's nurse, another lie to add to the collection. I'd called his office yesterday to confirm. No one from Sarah's family had contacted them about my medications. "You think of everything," I told her. David appeared from the kitchen, and I was struck again by how normal everything seemed on the surface. He smiled warmly and wished me a happy birthday, then launched into enthusiastic descriptions of the party decorations he'd been setting up since dawn. "We've got balloons, a beautiful banner, and I found a bakery that makes cakes for people with special dietary needs," he said. "I told them about your hearing situation and how you might need foods that are easy to digest." Foods that are easy to digest. More preparation for a woman they expected to be seriously ill very soon. "That's so thoughtful," I replied. "You two have been such a blessing to me these past few years." Sarah beamed at the compliment, but I caught something else in her expression. Relief, maybe, that I was still playing my expected role. As the morning progressed, I watched them work with new eyes. Every gesture looked different when viewed through the lens of what I knew. Sarah's careful arrangement of my medications on the kitchen counter. David's insistence on testing all the chairs to make sure I had the most comfortable spot, a chair positioned away from the other guests. where I could be monitored closely, their repeated suggestions that I should rest upstairs if I felt tired. Around noon, the first guests began arriving. My old colleagues from the hospital, neighbors I'd known for decades, a few distant relatives who still remembered to send Christmas cards. As I greeted each person, I felt a strange disconnect. They were celebrating my birthday while my daughter was planning my death. "Margaret, you look wonderful," exclaimed Janet Mills, my former supervisor from the cardiac unit. "That experimental surgery was clearly a success. Are you feeling well?" "Some days are better than others," I replied, using the same phrase I'd given Sarah earlier in the week. "But I'm grateful for every moment." Sarah appeared at my elbow immediately. "Mom tends to get tired easily now," she explained to Janet. "The surgery was successful, but recovery has been challenging." Janet, who'd known me for 15 years as a strong, competent nurse, looked puzzled. "Really? She seems quite energetic to me." "She's good at hiding it," Sarah said with a sad smile. "But Dr. Harrison warned us that patients sometimes push themselves too hard after experimental procedures. We have to watch her carefully." I watched Janet's expression shift from confusion to concern. Sarah was managing the narrative in real time, ensuring that everyone at my party would remember me as a frail woman who was declining rapidly despite her daughter's devoted care. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah made several attempts to get me to take various pills from her carefully organized collection. Each time, I deflected with requests for food or drink first, claiming I couldn't take medications on an empty stomach. I could see her growing slightly frustrated with my delays, but she couldn't push too hard without seeming unnatural. Around 4 o'clock, when most of the guests were gathered in the living room sharing stories and looking at old photo albums, Sarah approached with what she called my evening medications. "These are the important ones, Mom," she said, holding out 2 pills and a glass of water. "Dr. Harrison specifically said you needed to take them at exactly this time." I looked at the pills in her palm. They looked different from my usual medications. One was larger and a different color. The other was a capsule I'd never seen before. "What are these for again?" I asked. "The white one is for your blood pressure, and the capsule is a new supplement Dr. Harrison prescribed for brain health after experimental surgery." Her voice was patient, but I caught the slight tightness around her eyes. Brain health. How convenient that these mysterious new pills were supposed to help the very organ that would be blamed for my sudden death. "I think I should eat something first," I said. "Could you get me a small plate from the kitchen?" Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mom, you really need to take these now. The timing is important for your recovery." "Just a few crackers first," I insisted. "You know how sensitive my stomach is." For a moment, I thought Sarah might refuse, might insist I take the pills immediately regardless of my stomach concerns. But David appeared beside her, having overheard our conversation. "Of course, Margaret," he said smoothly. "Let me get you something to eat. We want you to be comfortable." He disappeared toward the kitchen, and Sarah forced a smile. "You're right, Mom. We don't want you getting nauseous at your own party." As David returned with a small plate of cheese and crackers, I caught Sarah checking her watch. Whatever timeline they were working with, I was apparently disrupting it. I ate slowly, savoring both the food and the growing tension I could see in my daughter's posture. When I finally reached for the pills Sarah had been holding, I palmed them instead of putting them in my mouth, then took a large sip of water and pretended to swallow. "There," I said brightly. "All done." Sarah's entire body seemed to relax. "Good, Mom. You should start feeling the effects soon." The effects. My loving daughter was waiting for me to show signs of whatever those pills were designed to do. I excused myself to use the bathroom, where I flushed the mysterious medications down the toilet. When I returned to the living room, Sarah was watching me with the intensity of a scientist observing an experiment. She didn't have long to wait for results because Margaret Thompson was about to give her the performance of a lifetime. 20 minutes after flushing Sarah's pills down the toilet, I began my carefully orchestrated decline. It started with subtle signs, a slight stumble as I walked past the coffee table, a momentary pause as if I were struggling to remember someone's name. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm the guests, but noticeable enough for Sarah to see. She was watching me like a hawk, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she witnessed what she thought were the beginning effects of whatever poison she'd tried to give me. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" she asked with perfectly feigned concern. I'm fine, I replied, but I let my voice sound slightly less steady than usual. Maybe just a little tired. Why don't you sit down for a moment, David suggested, immediately moving to clear a space on the couch. All this excitement can be overwhelming. I allowed myself to be guided to a seat, noticing how both Sarah and David positioned themselves nearby, ready to monitor my condition. Around us, the party continued, guests chatting about old times, laughing at shared memories, enjoying the cake David had ordered from his special bakery. None of them had any idea they were attending what my daughter hoped would be my farewell celebration. As the afternoon progressed, I escalated my performance gradually. A few more stumbles, some moments where I seemed confused about who was speaking to me, occasional complaints about feeling dizzy. Each symptom was carefully calibrated to suggest serious neurological problems without being dramatic enough to require immediate medical attention. Sarah played her role perfectly, the concerned daughter hovering near her declining mother. She suggested I might want to rest in the quiet kitchen, away from the stimulation of the party. She offered to help me upstairs to my bedroom. She repeatedly asked if I needed anything, her voice dripping with what sounded like genuine worry. But I could see the anticipation beneath her performance. She was waiting for my condition to worsen, for the moment when she would need to call an ambulance and begin the tragic narrative of her mother's sudden decline. Around 6 o'clock, as the last guests were preparing to leave, I decided it was time for the climax of my performance. I don't feel very well, I announced, letting my voice carry just enough to be heard by the remaining visitors. I think I need to lie down. Immediately, Sarah was at my side. Oh no, Mom, what's wrong? I'm dizzy, I said, swaying slightly, and my chest feels tight. A look passed between Sarah and David, quick, but I caught it. This was what they'd been waiting for. Let me help you upstairs, Sarah said. You probably just need some rest. Maybe we should call Dr. Harrison, suggested Mrs. Patterson from next door, who was putting on her coat. Those symptoms sound concerning. I'm sure it's nothing serious, David said quickly. Margaret just gets overwhelmed easily these days. A quiet evening should help. But Mrs. Patterson, who'd been a nurse before retirement, wasn't satisfied. Chest tightness and dizziness can be serious in someone Margaret's age, especially after experimental surgery. I could see panic beginning to creep into Sarah's expression. Her plan required me to deteriorate gradually, privately, where she could control the narrative. Having knowledgeable neighbors suggest immediate medical attention wasn't part of the script. Really, I just need to rest, I said, though I continued to sway as if struggling to maintain my balance. At least let me take your blood pressure, Mrs. Patterson offered. I keep a monitor in my purse. That's not necessary, Sarah said a bit too sharply. Then catching herself, she softened her tone. I mean, we don't want to make a big fuss over nothing. Mom just needs some quiet time. But Mrs. Patterson was already pulling out a compact blood pressure monitor. It'll just take a minute, Margaret, for my peace of mind. I could see Sarah calculating rapidly. Refusing would look suspicious, but allowing the test might reveal that my vital signs were completely normal, undermining her story about my declining health. Of course, I said, extending my arm. Thank you for caring. As Mrs. Patterson wrapped the cuff around my arm, I caught Sarah's eye. For just a moment, her mask slipped completely, and I saw pure rage flash across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by the concerned daughter expression she'd perfected over 3 years. The blood pressure monitor beeped softly as it completed its reading. Mrs. Patterson frowned at the display. That's strange, she said. Your blood pressure is completely normal. Actually, it's excellent for someone your age. Maybe the dizziness is just from all the excitement, I suggested weakly. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't convinced. Margaret, when did you last eat? Sometimes blood sugar fluctuations can cause these symptoms. I've been nibbling all afternoon, I replied truthfully. Mrs. Patterson looked thoughtful. Have you taken any new medications recently? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Sarah's face went completely white. Just her usual prescriptions, Sarah said quickly. Nothing new. Actually, I said slowly, Sarah gave me some different pills this afternoon. She said Dr. Harrison prescribed them for brain health. Mrs. Patterson turned to Sarah with interest. What medications were those? Just supplements, Sarah stammered. Nothing prescription. What kind of supplements? Some herbal remedies can interact with blood pressure medications and cause exactly the symptoms Margaret is experiencing. I watched Sarah struggle to respond. She couldn't provide details about medications that didn't actually exist, but she also couldn't admit she'd lied about Dr. Harrison prescribing them. "I don't remember the exact names," Sarah said finally. "I threw away the bottles after giving her the doses." Mrs. Patterson's frown deepened. "You threw away supplement bottles without keeping the labels? That's not safe practice, especially for someone with Margaret's medical history." The last few guests were watching now, sensing that something was wrong with this conversation. Sarah was trapped between her lies and an increasingly suspicious retired nurse who knew exactly what questions to ask. That's when I decided it was time to end my performance and begin the real show. "You know what?" I said, straightening up and dropping the dizzy act completely. "I'm feeling much better now. Must have just been all the excitement." The transformation was so sudden and complete that everyone in the room noticed. Mrs. Patterson stared at me in confusion, while Sarah's face went from white to gray. "That's wonderful, Mom," Sarah managed. "I'm so glad you're feeling better." "Actually," I said, my voice clear and strong, "I have something important to tell everyone before you leave." I looked directly at Sarah, whose eyes had gone wide with what I now recognized as fear. "I can hear again," I announced. "Perfectly. I've been able to hear everything for the past 2 weeks." The silence in the room was deafening, but not nearly as loud as the sound of Sarah's entire world crashing down around her. The silence that followed my announcement stretched for what felt like an eternity. You could have heard a pin drop in my living room, which was ironic, considering I just revealed that I'd been hearing everything for 2 weeks. Sarah's face went through a rainbow of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, pure terror. "What do you mean you can hear?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I mean exactly what I said, dear daughter," I replied, and I'll admit there was some satisfaction in watching her world crumble. "Dr. Harrison called 2 weeks ago to tell me the experimental surgery had worked beyond all expectations." My hearing returned completely. Mrs. Patterson was staring back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match. "Margaret, that's wonderful news. But why didn't you tell anyone?" "Oh, but I did tell someone," I said, looking directly at Sarah. "I told my lawyer yesterday, along with some very interesting recordings I've made over the past few days." Sarah's legs seemed to give out. She sank into the nearest chair, her face now completely colorless. David, who'd been frozen by the kitchen doorway, suddenly sprang into action. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," he said, moving toward the front door. "Sarah, we should probably go home and let your mother rest." "Sit down, David," I said firmly. "We're not finished talking." "Actually, we really do need to leave," he insisted, but his voice cracked on the words. Mrs. Patterson was looking increasingly confused. "What recordings, Margaret? What's this about?" Before I could answer, Sarah found her voice. "Mom's been acting very strangely lately," she said, though her usual confident tone was completely gone. "The experimental surgery has caused some side effects. Paranoia, confusion. She's been imagining things." "Have I?" I asked mildly. "Mrs. Patterson, would you like to hear what I imagined yesterday morning when Sarah thought I was in the garden?" I pulled out my phone, grateful that my nursing training years ago had taught me to be detail-oriented and prepared. I'd started recording conversations the day after my revelation about Sarah's true intentions. "Mom, don't," Sarah said, panic clear in her voice now. "You're going to embarrass yourself." "Oh, I think the embarrassment is going to be all yours, sweetheart." I pressed play on the recording I'd made of Sarah's phone conversation about medications and delayed complications. Her voice came through the phone speaker, crystal clear. "The house alone is worth $800,000 now, plus her life insurance, her savings account, the antique furniture. We're looking at over $1 million, maybe more." Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth. The few remaining guests who hadn't left yet moved closer, straining to hear. The recording continued with Sarah's casual discussion of medications that could cause complications, of making my death look natural, of the convenient timing right after a joyful celebration. When it ended, the silence was even more profound than before. Mrs. Patterson was staring at Sarah like she'd never seen her before. "Sarah," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, "what is this? What were you planning to do to your mother?" Sarah tried one last desperate play. That's not me on the recording. Mom's confused, maybe even having some kind of breakdown. She's been paranoid about everyone lately. But her voice was shaking so badly that even she didn't sound convinced by her own lies. Really? I said. Should I play the recording from this afternoon when you told David that I seemed to be responding to the pills faster than you expected? David made a sudden break for the door, but Mrs. Patterson, despite being in her 70s, was surprisingly quick. She moved to block his path. I don't think anyone should be leaving until we sort this out, she said firmly. Margaret, I think we need to call the police. Already done, I said, holding up my phone. I called them right before I made my announcement. They should be here any minute. As if summoned by my words, we heard sirens approaching. Sarah let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. You don't understand, she said desperately. We weren't really going to hurt you. It was just talk, just venting. People say things when they're frustrated. Frustrated about what, dear? My inconvenient continued existence? The sirens were getting closer. Through my front window, I could see red and blue lights turning onto my street. Mom, please, Sarah begged. And for a moment, she sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. We can work this out. I'm your daughter. I love you. No, I said quietly. You love my money. There's a difference. The police knocked on my door, and Mrs. Patterson hurried to let them in. 2 officers entered, their presence immediately changing the entire dynamic of the room. Good evening, the first officer said. We received a call about a potential attempted poisoning. That would be me who called, I said. I have evidence that my daughter and her husband have been planning to kill me for my inheritance. Sarah started crying then, great heaving sobs that might have moved me a week ago. But I'd heard too much, learned too much about who she really was. Ma'am, we'll need to hear the details, the second officer said, pulling out a notepad. Of course, but first you might want to test these. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag containing the pills Sarah had tried to give me earlier. I palmed these instead of taking them. I'd be very curious to know what's in them. David, who'd been silent since the police arrived, suddenly found his voice. This is insane. Margaret is having some kind of psychotic episode. Those are just over-the-counter supplements. Then you won't mind if we test them, the first officer said mildly. That's when David made his second attempt to leave, pushing past Mrs. Patterson and heading for the back door. This time he made it outside, but not far. I heard shouting from my backyard, then silence. Well, I said to the room in general, I suppose that answers the question about David's guilt. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews, evidence collection, and phone calls. Sarah was read her rights and taken away in handcuffs, still crying and protesting her innocence. David was brought back from my neighbor's yard, where he'd apparently tried to climb their fence and failed spectacularly. As the last police car pulled away from my house, Mrs. Patterson and I stood in my doorway, looking out at the quiet street. Margaret, she said finally, I have to ask, how long have you known? Known what? That my daughter was planning to kill me? Only a few days. Known that she didn't really love me? I paused, considering. I think some part of me has known that for years. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. What will you do now? I looked back at my house, which suddenly felt different. Not violated exactly, but changed. The scene of Sarah's birthday party for me was still visible. Balloons, decorations, the cake she'd ordered from a special bakery because she thought I'd be too sick to eat regular food. I think, I said slowly, I'm going to live, really live, for the first time in years. 3 days after my daughter's arrest, I was sitting in Detective Morrison's office, learning just how deep Sarah and David's plan had gone. The manila folder on his desk was thick with evidence, phone records, internet searches, financial documents that painted a picture of desperation and calculated murder. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Morrison said, opening the folder, I have to tell you, this case has been an education for all of us. The level of premeditation here is remarkable. Remarkable, I repeated dryly. That's one word for it. The pills you palmed contained a combination of substances that would have caused exactly the symptoms you pretended to have. Dizziness, chest pain, confusion. In the dosage they prepared, it wouldn't have killed you immediately, but it would have made you appear to be having serious neurological problems. I thought about how perfectly Sarah had reacted to my fake symptoms, How ready she'd been with explanations about brain complications from experimental surgery. They planned to establish a pattern of declining health, the detective continued. Over several weeks, they would have given you increasing doses until you either died or became so incapacitated that they could gain control of your finances through a conservatorship. A conservatorship? David had already consulted with a lawyer about having you declared mentally incompetent. They had documented what they claimed were incidents of confusion, memory loss, poor judgment. Detective Morrison handed me a printed email. This is from David to a legal firm, describing your supposed cognitive decline. I read the email with growing amazement. According to David's description, I was a confused elderly woman who couldn't manage basic tasks, who forgot appointments, who made irrational decisions. Every normal sign of aging or adjustment to hearing loss had been twisted into evidence of mental incompetence. They were building a legal case to take control of your assets, even if the poisoning plan failed, Detective Morrison explained. Very thorough. What about Sarah's claims that they were just venting, that they never intended to hurt me? The detective's expression grew grim. Mrs. Thompson, we found a detailed timeline on David's computer. Dates, dosages, expected progression of symptoms. They had planned this for months. And, he hesitated. And what? There are searches on their computer for funeral homes, cremation costs, even sympathy card templates. They were planning for your death, not your recovery. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the detective's office. Sarah hadn't just been planning to steal from me. She'd been planning to erase me entirely. There's more, Detective Morrison continued. We've traced some unusual financial activity, large cash withdrawals from your accounts over the past 6 months. Did you authorize Sarah to access your banking? She helped me set up online banking after my hearing loss, I said slowly. She said it would be easier than trying to communicate with tellers. She's been slowly draining your savings. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger bank alerts, but it adds up to about $40,000. $40,000. Money I'd saved for emergencies, for medical care, for the possibility that I might need expensive treatments as I aged. Sarah had been spending my security on what? Expensive dinners? Shopping trips? Down payments on the vacation home she'd mentioned wanting to buy? The good news is that it's all traceable, Detective Morrison said. We'll be able to recover most of it. But Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, had you noticed any signs that your daughter might be capable of something like this? I thought about the question seriously. Had there been signs? Or had I been so grateful for Sarah's attention after Robert died that I'd ignored red flags? She always seemed more interested in my finances than my health, I admitted. After Robert's funeral, one of the first things she asked about was whether I'd need help managing money. She seemed very concerned about the life insurance payout. What about her husband? How long have they been married? About 2 years. David was very charming when I first met him, very attentive, but I noticed he never seemed to have money for anything. Sarah was always paying for dinners, vacations, even his car repairs. Detective Morrison made notes on his pad. We're looking into David's background. Preliminary investigation suggests this isn't his first time being involved with financial crimes targeting elderly people. My blood went cold. What do you mean? He was previously married to a woman whose elderly mother died under suspicious circumstances. No charges were filed because there wasn't enough evidence, but the pattern is troubling. So Sarah hadn't just married a man who was willing to help her kill me for money. She'd married a man with experience in exactly that type of crime. Mrs. Thompson, we need to discuss protection for you while this case proceeds. Is there somewhere you could stay? Family members or friends? I almost laughed. Detective, the only family I had was apparently planning to murder me. And most of my friends are the same age I am. I can't burden them with this kind of danger. We can arrange for increased patrol presence in your neighborhood, but given what we've uncovered about David's background, we're concerned there might be other people involved. Other people. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If David had done this before, he might have contacts, people who helped with this sort of thing. What do you recommend? Honestly? A hotel for a few weeks, somewhere your daughter wouldn't think to look for you. Register under a different name, pay with cash. Let us handle the investigation while you stay safe. As I left the police station an hour later with a list of recommendations for secure accommodations, I realized that Sarah and David had succeeded in one part of their plan. They'd disrupted my life completely. Even though they were in jail, I was still being driven from my home, still living in fear. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on in all their careful planning. They'd assumed I was a helpless victim, someone who would accept whatever happened to her. Margaret Thompson, however, was proving to be much more resilient than anyone had expected, including herself. The extended stay hotel on the outskirts of town wasn't exactly luxurious, but it felt like a palace compared to spending another night in a house where my own daughter had been planning my murder. I'd registered under my maiden name and paid for a week in advance with cash, just as Detective Morrison had recommended. Sitting on the generic beige comforter, surrounded by my hastily packed belongings, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. For 3 years, I'd thought the worst thing in my life was losing my hearing. Now I knew that was actually the thing that had saved my life. My phone rang, making me jump. The caller ID showed my lawyer's number. "Henry? Any news?" "Margaret, I've been reviewing your financial records with the investigators. The situation is worse than we initially thought." I closed my eyes. "How much worse?" "Sarah has had access to your accounts for much longer than 6 months. I'm seeing unauthorized withdrawals going back almost to when your hearing loss began. Small amounts at first, then gradually increasing. She's taken nearly $90,000 over 3 years. $90,000, almost a third of my total savings, gone. But here's what's really troubling," Henry continued. "Some of the withdrawals coincide exactly with dates when you told me you were feeling generous and wanted to help Sarah with various expenses." "What do you mean? Do you remember last Christmas when you said you'd given Sarah money for new furniture? According to your bank records, she withdrew that money without your knowledge, then convinced you to give her additional money for the same purchase." The room felt like it was spinning. She was double-dipping, stealing money, then manipulating me into giving her more money for the same things. "Exactly. Margaret, your daughter has been running a sophisticated financial scam on you for years. The murder plot appears to have been Plan B, for when the theft became too obvious to continue." I thought back over the past 3 years, remembering all the times Sarah had mentioned needing help with expenses. The new refrigerator after theirs broke down. David's car repairs when his transmission failed. The vacation they needed to help Sarah recover from work stress. Every single time, I'd written her a check because I wanted to be supportive. Now I was learning that she'd also been stealing money for those same expenses. "Henry, is there any way to prove this? To show that she was manipulating me into believing I was making gifts when she was actually stealing?" "That's the brilliant part of her scheme," Henry said grimly. "You did write those checks willingly. You did authorize those gifts. The fact that she was also stealing money for the same purposes doesn't make the gifts themselves illegal. So she gets to keep the money I gave her voluntarily, even though she got it through lies? It's complicated. We might be able to make a case for fraud based on misrepresentation, but it would be difficult to prove. The theft charges are solid. That money we can recover. But the gifts..." Henry's voice trailed off. After hanging up, I sat in the hotel room trying to process the magnitude of Sarah's betrayal. It wasn't just the murder plot or even the theft. It was the systematic manipulation, the way she'd turned my love for her into a weapon against me. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your daughter wants to see you. She says she can explain everything." I stared at the message, my heart racing. How had anyone gotten this number? I'd given it only to Detective Morrison and Henry. Another message appeared. "She's very sorry. She just wants a chance to make things right." I was about to call Detective Morrison when a third message arrived, this one with a photo attached. It was a picture of my house, taken from across the street. Recent, based on the police tape still visible around the front door. The message with the photo read, "We know where you live. Better to talk this out." My hands were shaking as I dialed Detective Morrison's number. "Detective, I'm getting threatening messages. Someone knows where I am. Read me the messages exactly." I recited the texts, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mrs. Thompson, pack your things immediately. Don't use the elevator. Take the stairs. Go to your car and drive directly to the police station. Don't stop anywhere. You think I'm in danger?" I think David's background investigation just got a lot more urgent. We discovered he's been making phone calls from jail to numbers we haven't identified yet. It's possible he has associates on the outside. Associates. The word sent ice through my veins. Detective, I'm scared. I know. But Margaret, you did exactly the right thing by recording those conversations and calling us. You saved your own life. Now let us save it again. As I threw my belongings back into my suitcase, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been 3 days ago. She would have been terrified by this situation, paralyzed by the thought of people actively trying to harm her. But the woman packing her suitcase in this hotel room was someone different. She was angry, not just scared, angry that her own daughter had tried to kill her, angry that she was being driven from place to place by people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to money. Margaret Thompson had spent 70 years being polite, accommodating, grateful for whatever attention people gave her. But that Margaret was gone, replaced by someone who had heard too much truth to ever go back to comfortable lies. And this new Margaret wasn't going to run anymore. Instead of driving to the police station, as Detective Morrison had instructed, I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt absolutely necessary. I drove to the county jail, where Sarah was being held, and requested a visitor meeting. If someone was threatening me on her behalf, I wanted to hear directly from her what she thought that was going to accomplish. The visiting room at the county jail was exactly as depressing as you'd expect. Gray walls, uncomfortable plastic chairs, thick glass separating visitors from inmates. When Sarah was brought in, I barely recognized her. 3 days in jail had stripped away all her careful makeup and styling, revealing a woman who looked older and harder than the daughter I'd raised. She sat down across from me and picked up the phone on her side of the glass. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but I couldn't tell if it was from crying or lack of sleep. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I'm here because someone has been sending me threatening messages, claiming to represent you," I said without preamble. "I want to know what you've told David to do." Sarah's face went blank with confusion. "What messages?" "I haven't told anyone to contact you." "Really? Then how do you explain texts threatening me if I don't agree to meet with you?" "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't spoken to David since we were arrested. They won't let us communicate." I studied her face through the glass, looking for signs of deception. But Sarah looked genuinely bewildered by my accusation. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. Someone photographed my house and sent me threatening messages. If David has associates helping him, you need to tell me now." "Associates?" Sarah's voice rose. "What associates?" "Mom, David isn't some criminal mastermind. He's just—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He's just what?" "He's just weak," she said finally, "and greedy, and completely selfish, but he's not connected to dangerous people." For the first time since my arrest, Sarah sounded like she was telling the truth. "Then who's threatening me?" "I don't know, but Mom, you have to believe me. I never wanted you to get hurt. The plan was never to actually kill you." I leaned forward, pressing closer to the glass. "Sarah, I heard you planning my funeral. I have recordings of you discussing how to make my death look natural." "We were just talking," she said desperately. "Just working through frustrations. David has these gambling debts, and we were so stressed about money, and it was just fantasy, just venting." "Gambling debts?" Sarah's eyes widened as if she'd revealed something she hadn't meant to. Yes. David owes money to some people. Serious money." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "How much money, Sarah?" "A lot. More than we could ever pay back with our regular income." "How much?" $200,000, she whispered. $200,000. Suddenly, the threatening messages made perfect sense. David's associates weren't helping him threaten me out of loyalty. They were trying to ensure their money got paid. "Sarah, who does David owe money to?" "I don't know their names. He just called them investors. But Mom, they're not nice people. When David couldn't make payments, they started threatening both of us." "So, killing me for my inheritance was actually about paying off David's gambling debts?" Sarah nodded miserably. "We were desperate. They said if David didn't pay, they would hurt both of us. When David suggested the plan about your inheritance, it seemed like the only way out." I sat back in my chair, finally understanding the full picture. My daughter hadn't plotted my murder out of simple greed. She'd done it out of terror for her own life. "Sarah, when were you supposed to pay these people?" "This week," she said quietly. "The deadline was this Friday. Today was Wednesday. In 2 days, when David's creditors expected their money and didn't receive it, they would probably be very unhappy with everyone involved in the failed plan, including me. Who else knows about my inheritance? Who else knows how much money I have? David told them about the house value, the life insurance. He said he needed to give them details to convince them to wait for payment. So dangerous criminals now knew exactly how much I was worth and exactly why their money wasn't coming. Sarah, I need names. I need to know who these people are so I can protect myself. I can't, she said, genuine fear creeping into her voice. If they find out I gave their names to the police, they'll kill me. And if I can't protect myself from them, they might kill me anyway. We stared at each other through the glass. Mother and daughter, both trapped by David's greed and poor choices. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for Sarah. She was weak and she'd made terrible decisions, but she was also a victim of David's manipulation. Almost. Sarah, I said finally, you made a choice to marry a man with gambling debts. You made a choice to plan my murder instead of asking me for help with money. You made a choice to steal from me for 3 years. I'm sorry you're scared, but this is the situation your choices created. Mom, please, she begged. If you help me, if you pay David's debts, we can all just walk away from this. Pay his debts with my money so that you don't face consequences for trying to kill me for my money? I almost laughed at the audacity. Sarah, even if I wanted to help you, I wouldn't negotiate with criminals who are threatening my life. Then what are you going to do? I stood up from my chair. I'm going to survive this, just like I survived your murder plot. As I walked away from the visiting room, I could hear Sarah calling after me through the glass. But I didn't turn around. She'd made her choices, and now I had to make mine. The first choice was simple. I was done running. By the time I walked out of the county jail, I'd made a decision that would have shocked the old Margaret Thompson. Instead of running to the police for protection, I was going to solve this problem myself, but not in the way Sarah and David would expect. I drove straight to the bank and requested a meeting with the manager. Within an hour, I'd arranged for a cashier's check for exactly $200,000, the amount David owed his investors. But this wasn't going to be a simple payment to save my skin. This was going to be a trap. I called Detective Morrison from the bank parking lot. Mrs. Thompson, where are you? You were supposed to come directly to the station. I went to see Sarah first. Detective, we have a bigger problem than we realized. David owes gambling debts to dangerous people, and they expect payment by Friday. I explained what I'd learned from Sarah, watching Detective Morrison's expression grow more serious with each detail. So the murder plot was about paying off criminals, he said. That changes things significantly. It also gives us an opportunity, I said. They want money. I have money. What if we give them exactly what they want? Mrs. Thompson, we can't use you as bait. It's too dangerous. Detective, I'm a 70-year-old woman whose daughter tried to poison her for inheritance money. I think I've earned the right to decide what risks I'm willing to take. For the next 2 hours, we developed a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. I would contact David's creditors and offer to pay his debts in exchange for being left alone. But the meeting would be heavily surveilled by police, and the money I brought would be marked bills that could be tracked. The goal is to identify these criminals and gather evidence of their threats, Detective Morrison explained. Once we have that, we can arrest them for extortion and eliminate the threat to you permanently. And if they decide to just take the money and kill me anyway, that's why we'll have a dozen officers positioned around the meeting location. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? I thought about the question seriously. The old Margaret would have been terrified, would have preferred to hide and hope the problem went away. But the new Margaret, the one who could hear every word people said about her, wasn't interested in hoping anymore. Detective, these people are threatening me because they think I'm a helpless old woman whose family can be manipulated into doing terrible things for money. I'd like to show them how wrong they are. The meeting was arranged for Thursday evening at a restaurant downtown, public enough to seem safe, but with enough private areas for police to position themselves strategically. I arrived 30 minutes early, wearing a wire and carrying a briefcase with the marked bills. At exactly 7 o'clock, 2 men approached my table. They looked like what Central Casting would order if they needed generic threatening criminals. Expensive suits that didn't quite hide the bulge of concealed weapons, gold jewelry that cost more than most people's cars, and the kind of confident swagger that comes from years of getting paid to intimidate people. "Mrs. Thompson?" the taller one asked as they sat down without invitation. "That's me. And you are. Call me Mr. Vincent. This is my associate, Mr. Clark. We understand you have something that belongs to us. I have money that David owes you. Whether it belongs to you depends on your perspective, Mr. Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We like to think of debts as property, Mrs. Thompson. Your son-in-law took our property when he gambled with money he couldn't afford to lose. And now you think you can terrorize an elderly woman to collect it? We think we can use whatever methods work," Mr. Clark said. "Your daughter and her husband had a plan to solve this problem. When their plan failed, the debt became your responsibility." "Interesting logic," I said. "But I'm here, which means I'm willing to discuss terms." Mr. Vincent leaned forward. "Terms are simple. You pay David's debt plus interest. Call it $250 total, and we forget the Thompson family exists. And if I refuse?" "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Vincent said conversationally, "your house is very isolated. Your neighborhood is quiet. Accidents happen to elderly people all the time, especially ones living alone." That was exactly what Detective Morrison had hoped they would say. A clear verbal threat that would be captured on my wire. "Well," I said, "when you put it that way, how can I refuse?" I opened my briefcase and showed them the cashier's check. $250,000 as requested. Mr. Vincent reached for the check, but I pulled it back. "Before we complete this transaction, I have a question. How did you know about my inheritance? How did you know I could afford to pay David's debts? Your son-in-law was very detailed about your assets when he was asking for more time to pay," Mr. Clark said. "Nice house, good life insurance policy, substantial savings." He painted quite a picture. "So, when David and Sarah were planning to kill me, they were actually planning to kill me for you." Both men went very still. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Thompson." "It's also the truth. David told you about my money, and when he couldn't pay, you threatened him and Sarah until they agreed to murder me for the inheritance." "We don't know anything about murder plans," Mr. Vincent said carefully. "We just collect debts." "Really? Because my daughter is in jail right now for conspiracy to commit murder, and she's been very talkative about who pressured them into that plan." The two men exchanged glances. I could see them calculating, trying to figure out how much trouble they were in. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Vincent said slowly, "perhaps we should discuss a different arrangement." "No need," I said brightly. "I think our current arrangement is perfect." That's when Detective Morrison and 6 other officers emerged from their hiding spots around the restaurant, weapons drawn. "Police! Nobody move!" The next few minutes were controlled chaos as Mr. Vincent and Mr. Clark were arrested, searched, and read their rights. The marked money was confiscated as evidence, and the recordings from my wire were secured. As I watched them being led away in handcuffs, Detective Morrison sat down across from me. "Mrs. Thompson, that was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," I admitted. "But Detective, for the first time in 3 years, I feel like I have control over my own life. What are you going to do now?" I thought about the question. My daughter was in jail. My house felt contaminated by memories of betrayal. Most of my savings had been stolen or spent on this elaborate trap. But I was alive. I could hear every word people said around me, and I had learned something valuable about my own strength. "I think," I said, "I'm going to start over. Completely." 6 months later, I was living in a small coastal town 300 miles away from the site of my daughter's betrayal. I'd sold the house that held so many painful memories and used the money to buy a little cottage near the beach. Sarah had been sentenced to 3 years in prison. David got 5 years. Mr. Vincent and Mr. Clark were facing federal charges for extortion and conspiracy. I'd kept enough money from the house sale to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and the remainder went to establishing the Margaret Thompson Foundation, providing emergency financial assistance to families dealing with medical crises. Some mornings, I sat on my front porch with my coffee and listened to the ocean waves, still marveling at the gift of sound that had saved my life. The experimental surgery hadn't just restored my hearing, it had restored my ability to protect myself. Sarah wrote me letters from prison occasionally, always asking for forgiveness, always insisting she'd been a victim of circumstances. I read them carefully, listening for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding of what she'd done. I was still waiting to hear it, but that was Sarah's journey to make, not mine. My journey had led me to this cottage by the sea, where Margaret Thompson, the real Margaret Thompson, was finally free to live the life she'd always deserved. And every single day, I woke up grateful that I could hear the sound of my own future calling.